The train platform was crusted with frost, and the air smelled like a blade. Lillian Hart stepped off with her son Jonah, and a secret she held tighter than his little hand. She'd crossed half the country to escape a lie, but what she didn't know was that she was walking straight into a much bigger one. Her new life was supposed to start here, in this frozen valley, with a man she'd only ever met through letters. A man named Wyatt Carver. He appeared at the far end of the platform, a silhouette against the pale morning light. Tall, broad, with a revolver at his hip that wasn't just for show. He walked like he owned the ground under his feet, and maybe he did. His eyes were gray as stones, and they saw everything. She knew, right then, that this man was no simple rancher. "Mrs. Hart," he said. His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. "Yes," she managed, pushing her chin up. "And this is my son, Jonah." The words were a test, a dare. She hadn't mentioned the boy in her first letters. It was a truth she'd held back, afraid it would scare him off. Now, it was too late to hide. "I am sorry," she said, the words spilling out in a white puff of air. "I should have told you about the boy sooner. If this changes things, we can just get back on the next train." She held her breath, waiting for the rejection, for the cold dismissal she'd grown so used to. Jonah pressed his face into her skirt, clutching a little wooden horse like it was the only thing keeping him from blowing away. Wyatt Carver looked from her to the boy, his face unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the hissing steam of the train. Then, something shifted in his expression. The hard lines around his mouth softened, just a little. He crouched down, bringing himself eye to eye with Jonah. The movement was slow, deliberate, like he was calming a spooked horse. "No need for sorry," Wyatt said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "A boy ought to be with his mama." Jonah's eyes went wide. "Do you have horses?" he whispered. A small, slow smile touched Wyatt's lips. "A whole herd of 'em, waiting to meet you." Lillian felt a wave of relief so strong it almost buckled her knees. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. But then she saw them. At the end of the platform, a couple of townsfolk were watching, their faces pinched and curious. One of them, a woman in a heavy shawl, leaned over and whispered to her friend. The word carried on the frigid air, sharp and clear. "Baggage." Heat flooded Lillian's face. She wasn't just a new bride, she was a widow with a child. She was trouble. Wyatt's gaze flicked toward the women, a flicker of something hard and cold in his eyes, and then it was gone. He said nothing. He just picked up her trunk, like it was filled with feathers, and led them to the wagon. He was a man of few words, and she was starting to understand that his silences were louder than most men's shouts. The wagon ride to the ranch was quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of hooves on snow and the squeak of the wagon wheels. Lillian held Jonah close, trying to shield him from the cold and from the stares they'd gotten in town. They passed two riders who tipped their hats to Wyatt, but their eyes lingered on Lillian, sharp and assessing. One of them smirked and muttered something to his friend, and they both laughed. Wyatt's hands tightened on the reins, his knuckles white. He didn't say a word, but the anger coming off him was a physical thing, like heat from a stove. He was hiding something, she realized. The town wasn't just curious about her. They were watching him, and they weren't friendly. When they crested a ridge, the ranch spread out below them, a beautiful, sprawling valley that should have felt like a sanctuary. But all Lillian could feel was the weight of those stares, the echo of that cruel word. Baggage. The house was solid, smoke curling from the chimney, a promise of warmth. But as they pulled into the yard, Lillian felt a new kind of chill. This wasn't just a ranch. It was a fortress. And Wyatt Carver wasn't just a rancher. He was a man standing guard. But what was he guarding against? An older man named Hank met them at the door, his grin crooked and his eyes kind. He seemed friendly enough, but Lillian saw the way he looked at Wyatt, a quick, questioning glance that passed between them. It was a look between soldiers, not farmhands. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. It was a simple place, but clean and sturdy. Wyatt showed her to her room, set her trunk down, and turned to leave. Then he paused in the doorway. "I know what folks will say," he said, his voice low. "About you. About the boy. Let 'em talk. It's no one's business but ours." The words were meant to be a comfort, but they landed like a warning. "This is your home now," he said, his gaze intense. "Both of you." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet room. She sat on the bed, the quilt rough under her hands. A home. It was what she'd wanted, what she'd prayed for. But as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, she had the terrible feeling she hadn't just found a home. She had stumbled into the middle of a war she didn't understand. And Wyatt Carver, the man who was supposed to be her husband, was its silent, watchful general. The snow fell for 2 days straight, burying the valley in a blanket of white silence. Lillian learned the rhythm of the house, the way the floorboards creaked, the way the wind moaned around the eaves. She learned the rhythm of Wyatt, too. He was up before dawn, his movements quiet but purposeful, a man who wasted nothing, not a word, not a motion. He moved through his world with a grim efficiency that was both reassuring and terrifying. He said little, but he saw everything. He noticed the way she mended Jonah's coat, the way she coaxed the old stove to burn hot and even. He'd just nod, a small, almost imperceptible sign of approval. One afternoon, he took Jonah to the barn. Lillian watched from the kitchen window as Wyatt, this giant of a man, lifted her small son onto the rail of the horse corral. He pointed out the different horses, his voice a low murmur she couldn't hear, but Jonah was captivated. He leaned forward, his little face glowing with a joy she hadn't seen in months. For a moment, watching them, Lillian allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. But hope was a dangerous thing in a place this hard. And she learned just how hard 2 days later when they went to town for supplies. The town was just a single, dusty street, but it felt like 100 eyes were on her. Women stopped sweeping their porches to stare. Men paused their conversations to watch the wagon roll by. The whispers followed them like a cold draft. At the mercantile, the shopkeeper, a man named Tate with a mouth like a slit in a coin purse, looked down his nose at her. "Mr. Carver will be settling this, I presume," he said, his tone making it clear he thought she was nothing but a charity case. "I'll be paying for it myself," Lillian said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. She fumbled with her purse, and a few coins spilled onto the counter. Tate picked them up one by one, inspecting each as if it might be fake. "Tell Carver," he said, pushing her parcel across the counter, "that we don't run tabs for his projects." The insult hung in the air, thick and ugly. Lillian's face burned. She grabbed her things and fled, her heart hammering against her ribs. Back in the wagon, Wyatt took one look at her face, and his own went rigid. "What did he say?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. She told him, word for word. For a long, tense mile, Wyatt said nothing. He just stared at the road ahead, his jaw tight. Then, with a sudden, violent snap of the reins, he urged the horse into a gallop, the wagon lurching behind them. The silence in that wagon was more frightening than any shout. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. That night after supper, Wyatt pulled on his coat and went out. He was gone for over an hour. When he came back, there was a fresh dusting of snow on his shoulders and a grim set to his mouth. He didn't say where he'd been. He didn't have to. The next morning, when old Hank came in for breakfast, he glanced at Wyatt. "Heard Tate's store had a bit of an accident last night," Hank said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Front windows all smashed in. Wind, they're saying." Wyatt just took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes giving nothing away. But Lillian knew. It wasn't the wind. It was a message, and it had been delivered. She looked at this quiet, brooding man, and a cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. He wasn't just protecting her. He was marking his territory. And she and Jonah were now part of it. The realization was terrifying, because if Wyatt was willing to smash a window over a few cruel words, what would he do if a real threat came to their door? The days grew longer, the sun a little stronger, but the tension in the valley only deepened. Lillian found a quiet purpose in her work, in turning Wyatt's house into a home. She baked bread, patched his worn shirts, and scrubbed the floors until they shone. She was building a life, one small act at a time, a fortress of domesticity against the cold hostility of the town. Wyatt seemed to notice. He started leaving a bucket of fresh milk on the back step for her every morning. He brought her a length of blue calico from town, setting it on the table without a word. They were small gestures, but in the vast silence of their lives, they felt enormous. Jonah was coming alive in the wild freedom of the ranch. The fear and sadness that had clung to him since his father's death were starting to melt away. Wyatt found a gentle sorrel pony for him and spent patient hours teaching him to ride. Watching them together, a man who spoke in actions and a boy who was learning to trust again, Lillian felt a dangerous warmth spread through her chest. It felt like hope, but she knew better than to name it. Because every time they went to town, the whispers were there, waiting for them. "Look at her," one woman murmured as Lillian passed. "Playing the happy wife. Wonder how long it'll last." Another time, a man at the saloon laughed as Wyatt walked by. Carver finally bought himself a family. Hope he kept the receipt. Each remark was a stone thrown, and Lillian felt the bruises long after. One evening, she finally found the courage to speak of it. Wyatt was at the table, mending a bridle, his large hands surprisingly deft. "They talk about me in town," she said softly, her back to him as she kneaded dough. "About Jonah." Wyatt didn't look up from his work. "I know." She waited, her hands stilling in the dough. She needed to know if it mattered to him, if he regretted bringing her here. Finally, he set the leather strap down and met her eyes across the room. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "They used to talk about me, too," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Said this land would kill me, said I was running from something, said I wouldn't last a winter." He picked up the bridle again. "Let 'em talk. Talk is just air. It's what a man does that matters." The words settled deep inside her, a weight and a comfort all at once. He wasn't just offering her shelter, he was offering her a lesson in survival. Don't listen. Just do. From then on, she held her head a little higher in town. She met their stares with a cool resolve she didn't know she possessed. She was becoming a part of this harsh, beautiful place, her own roots digging into the rocky soil. And something was changing between her and Wyatt, too. The silences were different now, less empty, more comfortable. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, a strange, searching expression on his face. It made her stomach flutter in a way it hadn't in years. One evening, a storm blew in, a sudden, violent blizzard that turned the world to a churning wall of white. Wyatt had gone out to check the fences, and Jonah was playing on the porch. Lillian had just taken the bread from the oven when she realized the wind was shrieking, and the snow was coming down so thick she couldn't see the barn. She went to the door to call for Jonah. He was gone. All she could see were his small footprints, already half erased by the snow, leading away from the house toward the creek. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. The creek was a torrent of icy water, hidden beneath a treacherous crust of snow. "Jonah!" she screamed, her voice snatched away by the wind. She plunged into the blizzard, following the faint trail, her own tracks disappearing behind her. The world was a blinding chaos of white. She couldn't see, couldn't think, could only scream his name into the storm. Then she heard it, a thin, terrified cry. She stumbled down the slick bank of the creek and found him huddled under a fallen tree, shivering, his face streaked with frozen tears. She scooped him up, holding him tight. "I've got you," she sobbed, relief washing over her. But when she turned to go back, she froze. The house was gone. The barn was gone. There was nothing but the storm. They were lost. Just as despair began to set in, a shape emerged from the whiteout, a dark rider on a powerful horse, moving with impossible speed. It was Wyatt. He swung from the saddle, his face a grim mask of controlled fear. He swept Jonah up into his coat without a word, grabbed Lillian's arm, and hauled them both back toward the invisible safety of the barn. Inside, out of the wind, the sudden silence was deafening. Wyatt settled them on a pile of hay and stoked the small stove until it glowed red. "He'll be all right," Wyatt said, his voice rough after checking Jonah's cold fingers. "I should have watched him," Lillian whispered, her body trembling with the aftershocks of terror. "I should have—" "Don't!" Wyatt cut her off, his voice sharp. He looked at her, his gray eyes blazing. "You went after him. You found him. That's all that matters." The intensity of his gaze broke something inside her. "I thought we'd lost him," she cried, the tears finally coming. "I thought, maybe we don't belong here. Maybe this place is too hard." Wyatt was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "This is your home," he said, his voice soft but absolute. "You belong here. Both of you." And in that moment, she knew it wasn't just the land he was talking about. He meant with him. The storm raged all night. They stayed in the barn, wrapped in horse blankets, the warmth of the stove keeping the deadly cold at bay. By morning, the blizzard had passed. The world outside was silent, buried under a pristine blanket of snow, dazzling in the new sun. It felt like a fresh start, a world wiped clean. But as they walked toward the house, Wyatt suddenly stopped. His body went rigid. There, leading up to their front door, was a single set of footprints in the fresh snow. Someone had been there during the storm. Pinned to the door with a rusty nail was a folded piece of paper. Wyatt tore it from the wood, his face darkening as he read it. "What is it?" Lillian asked, a new fear coiling in her gut. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just anger in his eyes, but a cold, deadly rage. "It's from your past," he said, his voice flat. "From St. Louis. They've found you." The note was simple and brutal. "The boy has his father's eyes. A shame it would be to close them. We know you have the money. We'll be back for it." There was no signature. It didn't need one. It was from her dead husband's family. A family of criminals and thugs who believed she'd hidden a small fortune from them after he died. A fortune that didn't exist. This was what she had run from. This was the lie she had been living. And now it had followed her here, to this isolated ranch, to the one place she'd started to feel safe. Wyatt read the note again, his knuckles white where he gripped the paper. "How did they find you?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "I don't know," she whispered, her body shaking. "I was so careful." He looked out across the pristine snow, his eyes scanning the horizon. "They were here during the storm," he said. "Used it for cover. They were watching the house." The thought made her blood run cold. Someone had stood right outside their door while she and Jonah were lost in the blizzard, while Wyatt was searching for them. They had been completely vulnerable. "We have to go to the sheriff," she said, grabbing his arm. Wyatt looked down at her hand, then back at her face. His expression was grim. "There is no sheriff," he said quietly. "Not one that can help us. The nearest law is 100 miles from here. We're on our own." The words landed like a death sentence. They were isolated, exposed. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Wyatt's eyes hardened, turning to chips of granite. We prepare, he said. They said they'll be back. We'll be ready for them. The ranch transformed. It was no longer a home. It was a stronghold. Wyatt spent the next 2 days fortifying the place. He boarded up the back windows of the house, leaving only small slits to see through. He checked and rechecked his collection of firearms, a rifle, a shotgun, and the revolver he always wore. He showed Lillian how to load and fire the shotgun, his hands guiding hers with a cold, impersonal efficiency. You aim for the center, he instructed, his voice flat. Don't think. Just shoot. She held the heavy weapon, the cold metal a terrifying weight in her hands. This was her life now. The woman who baked bread and hung curtains was gone. In her place was a woman learning how to kill. Hank, the old ranch hand, moved with a quiet urgency she'd never seen before. He wasn't just a friendly old man, he was a seasoned fighter. He and Wyatt spoke in low, clipped tones, pointing to different parts of the valley, planning sight lines and fields of fire. They were soldiers preparing for a siege, and she and Jonah were the territory they had to defend. The nights were the worst. Lillian lay awake in the dark, listening to every creak of the house, every howl of the wind, imagining shapes moving in the shadows outside. Jonah slept fitfully, crying out in his sleep. She would hold him close, stroking his hair, her heart a cold, tight knot of fear. She had brought this danger to them. Her past was a poison that was now infecting this place, this man who had offered her a home. On the 3rd day, Wyatt rode out at dawn. Stay inside, he ordered. Don't open the door for anyone. He rode to the highest ridge overlooking the valley and stayed there for hours, a lone sentinel watching for the evil he knew was coming. Lillian watched him from the window, a small, dark figure against the vast, empty landscape. He was just one man against a threat they couldn't even see. The day dragged on, each hour stretching into an eternity of tense silence. Late in the afternoon, Wyatt returned, his horse lathered in sweat. They're coming, he said, swinging down from the saddle. 3 of them. They'll be here by nightfall. The final preparations were made in grim silence. Hank took up a position in the hayloft of the barn with a rifle, giving him a clear view of the yard. Wyatt gave Lillian the shotgun and placed her at the main window of the house. Jonah stays with you, he said. Keep him down, away from the windows. No matter what you hear, you stay here. You understand? She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He looked at her then, his eyes searching her face. You're stronger than you think, Lillian, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He gently touched her cheek, a brief, startling moment of tenderness in the face of the coming violence. Then he took his rifle and positioned himself by the front door, disappearing into the shadows. As dusk settled over the valley, the world grew quiet. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Lillian held Jonah, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep, and listened. She listened for the sound of hoofbeats, for the crunch of boots on snow. She listened for the sound of her life ending. Then she heard it. A single sharp crack of a rifle from the barn. The siege had begun. The first shot was followed by a barrage of gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up the twilight, angry bursts of orange against the blue snow. Lillian could hear men shouting, cursing, their voices alien and terrifying in the quiet of her home. She crouched lower, pulling Jonah tighter against her, her own breath roaring in her ears. The shotgun lay heavy across her lap. Could she use it? Could she take a life to save her own? The front window of the house suddenly exploded inward, showering the room with glass. A man was trying to climb through, his face a grotesque mask of rage in the dim light. He was just a few feet away from her. Without thinking, without allowing herself to feel, Lillian raised the shotgun. The roar was deafening, the kick sending a brutal shock through her shoulder. The man screamed and fell backward out of the window, leaving a dark stain on the snow. She stared at the empty, shattered window, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. She had done it. She had shot a man. She felt nothing. No horror, no remorse, just a cold, empty calm. From outside, she heard Wyatt's rifle crack again, followed by a scream of pain. Then, from the barn, Hank's rifle answered. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. Shouts, gunshots, the terrifying splintering of wood as bullets slammed into the walls of the house. Through it all, Wyatt moved like a ghost, firing from the doorway, then from another window, his movements swift and deadly. He was not a rancher. He was a warrior. Suddenly, a new sound. Fire. One of the men had gotten close enough to throw a torch onto the porch. Flames began to lick up the dry wood, casting a hellish, flickering light into the room. Smoke started to fill the air, acrid and choking. They were going to be burned out. "Lillian!" Wyatt's voice cut through the chaos. "The back! Get Jonah out the back!" She scooped up her sleeping son, grabbed the shotgun, and ran for the small back room she had used for storage. The window was boarded up, but Wyatt had shown her how to knock the planks loose. She kicked at them, her boots thudding against the wood. They wouldn't budge. Panic seized her. They were trapped. The smoke was getting thicker, burning her eyes, her lungs. Jonah started to cough, his small body shaking. Then the boards splintered as Wyatt's axe crashed through from the outside. He ripped the remaining planks away, creating a small opening. "Give him to me!" he yelled. She passed Jonah through the window into his arms. "Now you!" he said, reaching for her. She was halfway through when a shot rang out, impossibly close. Wyatt grunted and staggered back, his hand flying to his side. A dark stain was already spreading across his shirt. He'd been hit. Another man emerged from the shadows behind him, a pistol in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Now it's over, Carver," the man hissed. He raised the pistol, aiming it at Wyatt's head. Lillian, still tangled in the window frame, screamed. But before the man could fire, another shot echoed through the night, this one from the barn. The man with the pistol stiffened, a look of surprise on his face, before collapsing to the ground. Hank. The old man had saved them. But the danger wasn't over. The first man she had shot, the one who had tried to climb through the window, was crawling toward them, his face contorted in pain and rage. He had dropped his rifle, but he was pulling a knife from his belt. Wyatt was on the ground, struggling to get up, clutching his side. He was too weak, too slow. The man with the knife was going to kill him. Lillian scrambled the rest of the way out of the window, landing hard on the frozen ground. She still had the shotgun. She had one shot left. She raised the weapon, her arms trembling, and aimed at the crawling man. He was only a few yards away. "Do it, Lillian!" Wyatt gasped from the ground. She pulled the trigger. The blast echoed across the silent yard. And then there was nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the ringing in her ears. The fire on the porch had begun to die down, starved for fuel. The yard was littered with dark shapes that didn't move. It was over. Lillian dropped the shotgun and scrambled to Wyatt's side. "Wyatt," she breathed, her hands hovering over the wound in his side. It was bleeding badly. "It's all right," he grunted, trying to sit up. "It's not as bad as it looks." But it was bad. She could see it in the paleness of his face, the sweat on his brow. Hank came running from the barn, his face grim. "We need to get him inside," he said. Together they half-dragged, half-carried Wyatt back into the bullet-riddled house, laying him on the floor near the warmth of the stove. Jonah, now awake, watched with wide, terrified eyes. Lillian tore strips from her petticoat, her hands moving with a purpose she didn't know she had. She pressed the makeshift bandages against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. "You have to hold on," she whispered, her voice fierce. "You hear me, Wyatt Carver? You have to hold on." He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with pain. A faint, wry smile touched his lips. Never had anyone to give me orders before, he murmured, before his eyes drifted shut. For the second time in as many days, Lillian was fighting for a life. But this time, it wasn't her son's. It was the life of the man who had become her world. As she knelt beside him, pressing down on the wound, she finally understood. This wasn't just his home she had been defending. It was hers. Wyatt drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. The bullet had gone clean through his side, a ragged, ugly wound that bled and bled. Lillian didn't sleep. She sat by his side, changing the bandages, forcing sips of water between his lips, and praying with a desperation she had never known. Hank moved around the house like a worried ghost, cleaning the weapons, repairing the shattered window, and keeping a watchful eye on the valley. He told her Wyatt was tough, that he'd survived worse. But Lillian saw the fear in the old man's eyes. On the 3rd morning, Wyatt's fever broke. He opened his eyes, and they were clear. He looked at Lillian, a long, quiet look. "You saved me," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We saved each other," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. The town learned of the attack when Hank rode in for medicine. The story spread like wildfire. A widow and a reclusive rancher had single-handedly fought off 3 armed men. The whispers about Lillian Hart changed. The stares were no longer hostile. They were filled with a grudging respect and a little bit of awe. When she next went to the mercantile, Mr. Tate couldn't meet her eyes. He simply filled her order and pushed a bag of horehound candy across the counter. "For the boy," he mumbled. It was an apology, an acceptance. As Wyatt healed, the last of the snow melted, and the valley bloomed into a riot of green. It was as if the violence had been a final, brutal storm, and now spring had finally come. The ranch was scarred, the house pocked with bullet holes, but it was their home. They had defended it, bled for it, and made it their own. One evening they sat on the repaired porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Jonah was in the yard, chasing fireflies, his laughter echoing in the twilight. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Then he turned to her. "Those men," he said, "the ones who attacked us. They weren't just after you." Lillian looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Before I came here, I wasn't a rancher. I was a U.S. Marshal. I spent 10 years hunting down men like that. The family you married into. I'd put half of them in prison. When I retired, I came here, looking for peace. I thought no one would find me." He looked out at the darkening valley. "When I saw your letter, saw you were from St. Louis, running from a family of criminals, I knew it was them. I took a gamble. I thought maybe by bringing you here, I could finish what I started, protect you, and end it for good." The confession hung in the air between them. He hadn't just offered her a home out of kindness. It had been a trap for her enemies, and he had used her as the bait. A cold anger rose in her, followed by a wave of understanding. He had been fighting a war long before she arrived. He had simply invited her into the trenches. "You should have told me," she said, her voice quiet. "I know," he said, "but I saw the fear in your letters. I thought the truth would scare you away. And then you got here, with Jonah, and you were so strong, stronger than anyone I'd ever known. It stopped being about my past. It started being about our future." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "I was wrong not to tell you, Lillian. But I'm not wrong about this. This is our home. And I want to be more than just the man who owns it. I want to be your husband. In every way that matters." She looked at their intertwined hands, then at his face, earnest and open in the fading light. She thought of the man who had crouched down to speak to her son, the man who had smashed a window for her honor, the man who had stood between her and death. He had brought danger to her door, but he had also shown her how to face it. He had shown her the strength she never knew she had. "Okay, Wyatt," she whispered. "Okay." A slow smile spread across his face, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and transformed him. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, searching kiss that held all the promises of the spring, of the future, of a life finally, truly beginning. They had both come to this valley seeking refuge, hiding from their pasts. And in the crucible of violence and fear, they had found something more. They had found each other. They had found home. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what comes next.